This is a special report from ABC News Digital.
John Kerry in Kiev, the Secretary of State in Ukraine today with two missions: de-escalate the situation in Crimea and provide symbolic and material support to Ukraine's interim government. Kerry brings with him a generous aid package and the threat of sanctions. Over in Moscow, Russian President Vladimir Putin's first public appearance since the crisis in Crimea began. Putin said today the use of force is still on the table. Hey everyone, I'm Michelle Franzen in New York with this ABC News Digital special report. All eyes on Crimea today, where Russian forces expand their grip over military facilities in the region. Today, the tension reaching a near breaking point as Russian troops that had taken over the airbase fired warning shots into the air as 300 Ukrainian soldiers marched towards the base demanding their jobs back. The Ukrainian troops eventually standing down after Russian forces threatened to open fire. And right now, joining us from Crimea on the phone, I want to bring in ABC's Alex Marquardt from the Ukraine on the phone. Alex, thank you very much for joining us. Tensions, of course, running high in that entire region. Give us a rundown of what you've been experiencing.
Well, what you just described just now, the scene that happened this morning outside of the Belbek airfield was some of the more dramatic moments that we've seen over the past few days. As you noted, Russian forces have really been tightening their control, but this is one of the first confrontations that we've seen between Ukrainian and Russian forces, and luckily it did end peacefully. There were a few nerve-wracking moments there when the Russian forces fired in the air. They fired warning shots to make it clear that they didn't want the Ukrainian forces to advance any further. Then there were 4 hours of tense negotiations between the two sides, and then eventually the Ukrainian troops retreated to their base, where we have now spent much of the day. The Russians still control the airfield. The Ukrainians control the base. Ukrainian forces are still on a number of bases in Crimea, but that is really the only control that they have on the peninsula. Russia has essentially completed its takeover of Crimea, except for a few spots where there are still Ukrainian troops holding out.
And Alex, we are showing video of that as it occurred earlier today. Can you give me an idea, since President Vladimir Putin has spoken, has that changed anything of the tensions? Has it escalated anything on the ground there?
Well, it's really done all of the above. I mean, it's escalated tension insofar as he did not rule out military action in other parts of Ukraine. So far, the Russian actions are limited to the Crimean Peninsula. But he talked today saying he hoped that he didn't have to do anything else in the rest of Ukraine, which was a tacit acknowledgement of the fact that Russian troops are here, although he didn't say as much. He was certainly unapologetic about why Russia came in here, and that was to defend Russian citizens, he said. But at the same time, he did emphasize diplomacy, and we've learned just in the past few moments that the Ukrainian and Russian governments are talking to each other. So that is a glimmer of hope. That we will be able to get out of this situation and de-escalate it diplomatically rather than resorting to force, which is still a very real possibility.
And that, Alex, of course, as Secretary of State John Kerry arrives in Kiev, set to speak at any moment, also arriving with an aid package. President Putin was not shy about pointing the finger at the U.S. for what he called interference. If Russia does annex Crimea, will Europe or the U.S. respond, and how so?
That's an excellent question. The White House has made it very clear that they do not see any sort of military, any sort of boots on the ground, any sort of military deployment by American forces. That is really off the table, and that's the only thing that we know for sure. The other things that have been talked about are economic sanctions. The State Department said yesterday that the United States is preparing economic sanctions against Russia, which Putin responded to rather angrily today. There have also been discussions about kicking Russia out of the G8 and not attending the G8 conference in Sochi this summer. So what the U.S. Seems to be pursuing is a policy of isolationism, getting its allies, Europe and others, to isolate Russia. But that so far that doesn't seem to be working.
So there's the threat of possible sanctions. We are bringing aid package to Ukraine. What about the role of NATO and the NATO forces? What might that be?
Well, this is a perfect example of when the U.S. is certainly happy to be part of NATO because they don't want to take any sort of unilateral action themselves. And so this has to be an international commitment through the European Union, through the OSCE, through NATO, through United Nations. The U.S. wants to make sure that this is an international condemnation of Russia, that the international community as a whole is standing firm against Russia and once again trying to isolate it as much as possible, make President Putin realize that he's making a mistake and that he's taking all that goodwill that Russia has really accumulated over the past few weeks in Sochi, putting on such a fantastic Olympic Games, and essentially flushing that down the drain.
And Alex, you yourself, have witnessed some of this aggression stance from the Russian military. Give us an idea, again, what the mood is there, how hard it is for anyone to maneuver around there, let alone reporters.
Well, it's really been remarkable over the past few days because there has been this Russian intervention. We've seen Russian troops all over the place, at the government buildings, at the airport, at various checkpoints, and we've filmed in front of them. I've walked right up to them. They won't talk to me, but they've never been aggressive. They've always been very passive, very silent. Today was really something quite different.
Alex, thank you very much. I want to go to Secretary of State John Kerry, who's prepared to speak right now. Thank you.
Let me say, first of all, how incredibly moving it was to walk down Institutska Street and to have a chance to be able to pay my respects on behalf of President Obama and the American people at the site of last month's deadly shootings. It was really quite remarkable. I have to tell you, to see the barricades, see the tires, see the barbed wire, see the bullet holes in street lamps, the extraordinary number of flowers, the people still standing beside a barrel with a fire to keep them warm, the shrouded vision in the clouds and the fog of the buildings from which the shots came, and the pictures, the photographs of those who lost their lives, of the people who put themselves on the line for the future of Ukraine. It was deeply moving to walk into a group of Ukrainians spontaneously gathered there and to listen to them, to listen to their pleas of passion for the right not to go back to life as it was under former President Yanukovych. One woman who pleadingly said how poor they were, how the rich lived well, and how those in power took the money and how they were left behind. And particularly one man who told me that he had recently traveled to Australia and he had come back here, but he came back determined to be able to live as he had seen other people live in other parts of the world. So it was very moving, and it gave me a deep personal sense of how closely linked the people of Ukraine are to not just Americans, but people all across the world who today are asking for their rights, asking for the privilege to be able to live, defining their own nation, defining their futures. That's what this is about. And the United States extends our deepest condolences to those whose grief is still very fresh, and those who lost loved ones, who bravely battled against snipers on rooftops and people armed against them with weapons they never dreamt of having. These brave Ukrainians took to the streets in order to stand peacefully against tyranny and to demand democracy. So instead, they were met with snipers who picked them off one after the other as people of courage, notwithstanding the bullets, went out to get them, drag them to safety, give them comfort, expose themselves. They raised their voices for dignity and for freedom. But what they stood for so bravely, I say with full conviction, will never be stolen by bullets or by invasions. It cannot be silenced by thugs from rooftops. It is universal. It's unmistakable. And it's called freedom. So today, in another part of this country, we're in a new phase of the struggle for freedom. And the United States reaffirms our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity according to international law. We condemn the Russian Federation's act of aggression, and we have throughout this moment evidence of a great transformation taking place, and in that transformation we will stand with the people of Ukraine. Today, Ukrainians are demanding a government with the consent of the people. And I have to say that we all greatly admire the restraint that the transitional government has shown as it makes this transition. They have shown restraint, despite an invasion of Ukrainian homeland and a Russian government that has chosen aggression and intimidation as a first resort. The contrast really could not be clearer. Determined Ukrainians demonstrating strength through unity, and the Russian government, out of excuses, hiding its hand behind falsehoods, intimidation, and provocations. In the hearts of Ukrainians and the eyes of the world, there is nothing strong about what Russia is doing. So it's time to set the record straight. The Russian government would have you believe it was the opposition who failed to implement the February 21st agreement that called for a peaceful transition, ignoring the reality that it was Yanukovych who, when history came calling, when his country was in need, when this city was the place where the action was, where the leaders of the nation were gathered in order to decide the future, he broke his obligation to sign that agreement, and he fled into the night with his possessions, destroying papers behind him. He abandoned his people and eventually his country. The Russian government would have you believe that the Ukraine government somehow is illegitimate or led by extremists, ignoring the reality that the Rada, representing the people of Ukraine, the elected representatives of the people of Ukraine, they overwhelmingly approved the new government, even with members of Yanukovych's party deserting him and voting overwhelmingly in order to approve this new government. It was thanks in parts to the votes from Yanukovych's own party that the future of Ukraine changed. And today the Rada is the most representative institution in Ukraine. The Russian government would also have you believe that the calm and friendly streets, one of which I walked down, but many of which I just drove through, that somehow these streets of Kiev are actually dangerous, ignoring the reality that there has been no surge in crime, no surge in looting, no political retribution here. The Russian government would have you believe, against all the evidence, that there have been mass defections of Ukrainians to Russia, or that there have been mass attacks on churches in eastern Ukraine. That hasn't happened either. They would have you believe that ethnic Russians and Russian bases are threatened. They'd have you believe that Kiev is trying to destabilize Crimea, or that Russian actions are legal or legitimate because Crimean leaders invited intervention. And as everybody knows, the soldiers in Crimea, at the instruction of their government, have stood their ground but never fired a shot, never issued one provocation, have been surrounded by an invading group of troops, and have seen an individual who got 3% of the vote installed as the so-called leader by the Russians. They would have you believe that Kiev is trying to destabilize Crimea, or that somehow Russian leaders invited intervention. Not a single piece of credible evidence supports any one of these claims. None. And the larger point is really this. It is diplomacy and respect for sovereignty, not unilateral force, that can best solve disputes like this in the 21st century. President Obama and I want to make it clear to Russia and to everybody in the world that we are not seeking confrontation. There's a better way for Russia to pursue its legitimate interests in Ukraine. If you were legitimately worried about some of your citizens, then go to the government, talk to them about it. Go to the UN, raise the issue in the Security Council. Go to the OSCE, raise it in one of the human rights organizations. There are countless outlets that an organized, structured, decent world has struggled to put together to resolve these differences so we don't see a nation unilaterally invade another nation. There's a better way for Russia to pursue its legitimate interests in Ukraine. Russia can choose to comply with international law and honor its commitments under the Helsinki Final Act under the United Nations Charter. If it wants to help protect ethnic Russians, as it purports to, and if they were threatened, we would support efforts to protect them, as would, I am told, the government of Ukraine. But if they want to do that, Russia could work with the legitimate government of Ukraine, which it has pledged to do. It cannot only permit, but must encourage international monitors to deploy throughout Ukraine. These are the people who can actually identify legitimate threats. And we are asking, together with the government of Ukraine, together with the European community, for large numbers of observers to be able to come in here and monitor the situation and be the arbiters of truth versus fiction. Russia, if it wanted to help de-escalate this situation, could return its troops to the barracks, live by the 1997 base agreement, and de-escalate rather than expand their invasion. Now, we would prefer that. I come here today at the instruction of President Obama to make it absolutely clear the United States of America would prefer to see this de-escalated. We would prefer to see this managed through the structures of legal institutions, international institutions that we've worked many years in order to be able to deal with this kind of crisis. But if Russia does not choose to de-escalate, if it is not willing to work directly with the government of Ukraine, as we hope they will be, then our partners will have absolutely no choice but to join us to continue to expand upon steps we have taken in recent days in order to isolate Russia politically, diplomatically, and economically. I would emphasize to the leaders of Russia, this is not something we are seeking to do. This is something Russia's choices may force us to do. So far, we have suspended participation in the preparations for the Sochi G8 summit. We have suspended military contacts, and we have suspended bilateral economic dialogue. And we are prepared to take further steps if Russia does not return its forces to the barracks and engage in a legitimate policy of de-escalation. At the same time, the United States and its partners, our partners, will support Ukraine. We will support it as it takes difficult steps to deal with its economy. And I appreciate the meeting that I just had with the acting president and the prime minister. and other leaders as we discussed how to strengthen the economy and move rapidly towards free, fair, open elections that can take place very shortly. We are working closely and will continue to work closely with the IMF team and with international partners in order to develop an assistance package to help Ukraine restore financial stability in the short run and to be able to grow its economy in the long run. I'm pleased to say that this package includes an immediate $1 billion in a loan guarantee to support Ukraine's recovery, and we are currently working with the Treasury Department of the United States and with others to lay out a broader, more comprehensive plan. We will provide the best expertise available to help Ukraine's economy and financial institutions repair themselves and to work towards these free, fair, fast, inclusive elections. We're also working with the interim government to help combat corruption and to recover stolen assets. And we are helping Ukraine to cope with Russia's politically motivated trade practices, whether it's manipulating the energy supply or banning the best chocolates made in Ukraine. The fact is, this is the 21st century, and we should not see nations step backwards to behave in 19th or 20th century fashion. There are ways to resolve these differences. Great nations choose to do that appropriately. The fact is that we believe that there are a set of options available to Russia and to all of us that could move us down a road of appropriate diplomacy, appropriate diplomatic engagement. We invite Russia to come to that table. We particularly invite Russia to engage directly with the government of Ukraine, because I am confident they are prepared to help work through these issues in a thoughtful way. I'm very proud to be here in Ukraine. Like so many Americans and other people around the world, we've watched with extraordinary awe the power of individuals unarmed except with ideas, people with beliefs and principles and values who have reached for freedom, for equality, for opportunity. There's nothing more important in this world. That is what drives change in so many parts of the world today. It's really partly why the world is in such a state of transformation in so many different places at the same time. Because we're all connected. We all understand what other people are doing and the choices they have and the lives they get to lead. And all over the world, young people are saying, we do not want to be deprived of those opportunities. That's what this is about. And it is about all those who value democracy and who support the opportunity for this country to join the legions of others who want to practice it. The United States will stand by the Ukrainian people as they build the strong, sovereign, and democratic country that they deserve, and that their countrymen and women just so recently gave their lives in extraordinarily courageous acts in order to ensure for the future. We must all step up and answer their call. I'm happy to take some questions.
Great, thank you. The first question is from Andrea Mitchell of NBC. There's a microphone coming. Just give it 1 second.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, U.S. officials have been saying that Vladimir Putin will be isolated by his actions, yet today he seemed defiant. Speaking for an hour, taking questions, he said, among other things, that Russia reserves the right to take any action, to use any means, obviously military means. He described events here as an unconstitutional coup. He denied that there were any Russian troops in Crimea, occupying Crimea. He blamed the crisis on United States interference, saying that the U.S.
You really denied there were troops in Crimea?
Yes, he did. He also blamed the crisis on the United States, saying that the United States was acting as though it were conducting an experiment across the ocean on lab animals, on rats here. And he showed no sign of being ready to step down or de-escalate the military presence in Crimea. There have been shots fired today. There's the presence reported of naval Russian ships along the isthmus between Ukraine and Crimea. So with all of that, how has the U.S. pressure worked against Putin? What is your reaction to his assertions? And also, while you were here, you met with many leaders. You did not meet with Yulia Tymoshenko. Is she viewed by the United States as not part of the solution, or as possibly part of the problem?
Well, let me answer the last part of the question first. Not at all. I thought I actually might bump into her, but I didn't. I had meetings with the current group that represent the parties that have come together, and most likely presidential candidates, this moment group, with whom I've been in touch and working with. I met with a number of them in Munich previously, and so we continued that conversation. With respect to President Putin's comments, I've spoken as directly to President Putin today as I can to invite him to engage in a legitimate and appropriate dialogue, particularly with the current government of Ukraine, knowing that there's an election in 90 days and the people of Ukraine will have an opportunity to ratify their future leadership. The fact is that in the eastern part of the country, Russia recently tried to get a couple of city councils to actually pass something asking for Russians to come in. And lo and behold, those councils did the opposite. They said, we don't want Russia to come in. We want our independence. And I think that it is clear that Russia has been working hard to create a pretext for being able to invade further. Russia has talked about Russian-speaking minority citizens who are under siege. They're not. And in fact, this government has acted remarkably responsibly by urging total calm, by not wanting to have any provocation, by avoiding even their troops who have a legal right to resist the invasion of other troops, but has ordered them not to engage to give a pretext of anybody being in danger. Here in the streets today, I didn't see anybody who feels threatened, except for the potential of an invasion by Russia. So I would hope that President Putin, who is insisting against all evidence everywhere in the world about troops being in Crimea, that they're not there, that he will step back and listen carefully, that we would like to see this de-escalated. We are not looking for some major confrontation. And I do not believe that his interests, which we understand, a base, strong ties, everybody knows that, Khrushchev gave the Crimea to the Ukraine back in 1954 or 6, I think it was. We all know these things. There's a long history of connection. We get it. But those things can continue and be worked out through the legal process, through the direct relationship with the government of Ukraine. It is not appropriate to invade a country and at the end of a barrel of a gun dictate what you are trying to achieve. That is not 21st century G8 major nation behavior. And what we are looking for here is a responsible way to meet the needs of the parties, but respect the integrity, the sovereignty, the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And in fact, the UN Charter, the final act of Helsinki, the 1994 Budapest Agreement, and the 1997 base agreement between Russia and Ukraine all require a certain set of standards which have not been followed here. So, again, we would like to see President Putin address the problems not by deploying forces, not through confrontation, but by engaging in the time-honored tradition of diplomacy, of discussion, of negotiation, and let's find a path forward which puts everybody on a track that benefits this region and the world more effectively.
And will Germany stand with you against
Excuse me. We will be having further discussions. I think the President will be talking before long with Chancellor Merkel. I'm having more conversations with Foreign Minister Steinmeier. And I believe we will stand united. I believe that, yes.
Great, and our final question comes from Maria Koreniuk of Euronews.
My question is the following. Have the United States ever considered any other methods of influence on Russia except diplomatic or economical sanctions? And by the way, how can you comment the information that has appeared in mass media today about 2 American aircraft carriers that are heading into the direction of the Black Sea region? And if you don't mind, second question, you mentioned substantial financial support for Ukraine. So the question is actually when Ukraine can get this kind of support. Thank you.
Well, let me answer the second part first. We're working on support as rapidly as we can make it available. We already have people working on the economic, with the IMF team, consulting with the government, working to get the facts together. We're trying to actually define the needs as accurately as is possible. And as I said to you, we've announced the $1 billion loan guarantee. We actually have the money appropriated. We know where we're heading with that. We have additional initiatives that can be quickly put together as our team works in Washington. The President has instructed all of us to look at every option available with respect to direct economic aid. And the President, particularly yesterday, when he met with Prime Minister Netanyahu in the White House, made a statement about Ukraine in which he asked Congress, which has been making very strong statements about support for Ukraine, to come to the table quickly with an economic package appropriated by the Congress. We want that to happen immediately. So this is urgent. We understand that. I don't think it's appropriate for the United States or any other country to come here, talk about the strength and courage of the people in the streets, to underscore the value of democracy and of freedom that people are fighting for here, and then just walk away and not do anything about it. So we are committed, and we are going to work to do what we can within our system as rapidly as possible. And with respect to the first part of the question,
And you have been listening to Secretary of State John Kerry speaking in Kiev as he meets with the new Ukraine leaders at this hour, speaking live to reporters there in that region. And Secretary of State John Kerry also touring a bit of the Independence Square in that area. And he said that he met with some of those demonstrators that were caught up in the violence over the last few weeks. And we want to bring in ABC's Mary Bruce at the White House, who's also been listening in on this. Mary, thank you so much for joining us. President Obama also just spoke on Ukraine. A lot of words being thrown back and forth here. What did he say?
That's right. Good afternoon. The president is delivering a speech nearby here in Washington, actually outlining his budget, but he did take a moment to pause and mention the Ukraine. He mentioned that aid package that Kerry has now brought to Kiev today. It's $1 billion in U.S.-backed loan guarantees. The president urging Congress to once again act on that aid package because, remember, just as the United States and its allies work to gather a proposition that could probably put pressure on Putin to try and withdraw some of his forces there, this administration wants to also offer help to the new fledgling government in Ukraine, show its solidarity with that government, which of course is what Secretary Kerry is doing during his trip today. And the president said today that he thinks all of these actions are causing Putin to pause and think about the steps the United States is taking. Let's take a listen.
There's something immediately Congress can do to help us, and that is to help finance the economic package that can stabilize the economy in Ukraine, help to make sure that fair and free elections take place very soon, and as a consequence, helps to de-escalate the crisis. In the meantime, we're consulting with our international allies across the board. Together, the international community has condemned Russia's violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. We've condemned their intervention in Crimea, and we are calling for a de-escalation of the situation and international monitors that can go into the country right away. And above all, we believe that the Ukrainian people should be able to decide their own future.
So some more tough talk from the president here today, urging Congress to go ahead and act and pass this aid package as they try to help the new government in Ukraine get off the ground, get their economy up and running, and once again urging Russia to de-escalate the situation. Michelle?
Mary, one quick question. You know, we heard a lot of words being thrown around. We've heard where Secretary Kerry says that they're there for support. We've heard President Putin talk about how it's interference from the U.S. Give me an idea. What do you think that the president and the White House and his national security team will be talking about as this goes forward?
Well, that's really the big question here, is how is this administration and the U.S. allies going to respond? What are they going to do to try and put pressure on Putin? Because so far we've heard some threats, we've heard a lot of tough talk, as we mentioned, from this administration, but no real concrete actions to try and punish Putin, essentially, to get him to withdraw some of those forces and de-escalate the situation. Now, as Alex mentioned earlier, there are several options they're considering. All are largely economic. It's very likely that they'll pass sanctions against the Russian government. That's one option that's getting a lot of buzz. And of course, the U.S. has halted those discussions in preparation for the G8 summit coming up in June in Sochi. All of the other global 8 leaders have also stopped those meetings. And there is, of course, the option to go ahead and turn the G8 back into the G7 and essentially kick Russia out of the group of 8. But so far, all of these are just options that are being considered. No concrete steps have been taken just yet.
Mary Bruce from the White House, thank you very much. For the latest on what's happening in Ukraine, I also want to bring in ABC News' chief foreign affairs correspondent, Terry Moran in Crimea. Terry, thank you for joining us. We've heard a lot of rhetoric going back and forth. What are the odds that Russia now pulls back, calls its troops, as Secretary Kerry said, back to the barracks?
At this point, Michelle, zero. The Russian forces are now in control of this part of Ukraine. The deed is done. It's done. Putin now has complete control of the Crimean Peninsula, this crucial section of Ukraine. He's got control through his forces, and he's got control now through a very pliant, even puppet leadership, as Secretary Kerry pointed out, installed here. He also has control because it is quite likely a majority of the people here in Crimea who are, many of them, Russian ethnic nationals, support the Russian troops. We have been chased off, run off a couple of these military confrontations at Ukrainian bases by crowds of very angry Crimeans who want the protection, they say, of Russia from a revolution in Kiev, where Secretary of State Kerry is, that they don't agree with, that they fear. And so Putin is now in control. He's not going to back down. This might be negotiated out of some way, but there's no way that President Putin is backing down right now.
And part of those negotiations, we've heard about economic sanctions being mentioned against Russia. Secretary Kerry saying that they would also isolate Russia in other ways, diplomatically. How could this work in those negotiations that you mentioned?
Well, that's very tough. You got to have sticks and you got to have carrots in negotiations. And Secretary of State Kerry is talking about sanctions and other means. The Europeans are already balking at some of the stricter sanctions that might be applied, because Europe needs Russia. It needs Russia's gas, natural gas. It needs Russia's business. The city of London, which is a financial center, needs Russian money coursing through it. They're dependent on Russia, deeply integrated. And so it's unlikely that the kind of sanctions that some in the U.S. Congress are considering would be accepted by Europe. That said, there's no question Putin faces a lot of united outrage in the West. The question is how to negotiate forward. And the answer is probably some force on the ground here, monitors from one of the international groups who might be able to stand between the Russian population and the Ukrainian population, if that's a concern of Vladimir Putin's. Some kind of super autonomy negotiated for this part of Ukraine, perhaps even with a role for Russia in it. Whether that would be acceptable in Kiev or not, who knows? But that's what diplomacy is for. It's for all kinds of creative solutions. What raw power is for is, as I say, what's already been done. Vladimir Putin has created facts on the ground. And he knows that he holds the stronger cards in these negotiations right now.
You know, Terry, we're seeing video, of course. We watched Vladimir Putin, President Putin, speak this morning. We also have seen Secretary Kerry as he visited Independence Square, saying that he spoke to some of these demonstrators. In the days that have followed the weeks of violence, we haven't seen much else going on. Give us an idea of what is going on there. Secretary Kerry mentioned the great restraint that this transitional government has been taking in the interim.
Well, there's no question. I was in Kiev a couple of weeks ago when the protests were reaching their peak and the revolution was about to reach its violent and bloody climax. And there's no question that the people who made that revolution yearn to belong and to have ties with the West, with all of the promises of freedom and democracy and prosperity. This is a desperately poor nation. They want to move to the West. In this part of the country, it's very, very different. Here, the Ukrainian troops are outnumbered. The Ukrainian population is cowed in fear of Russian power. I talk to people who come forward to speak their views that they don't want the Russians here quietly, respectfully. I've asked a couple of people, if Vladimir Putin was here, what would you tell him? And they almost drop their eyes and their voice in modesty and in humility in the face of the power that Putin has and represents over their lives. So the Ukraine cannot take on Russia, militarily or nationally at this point. And so they've got to find a way out, a way to keep their nation together, a way to avoid a war with Russia, which they wouldn't win and which would be a kind of civil war. These two countries very closely bound by language, by kinship and history. They need to walk that careful path that you talk about, and you can sense that here. However, this whole place, I must tell you, Michelle, is a tinderbox. It seems that the slightest problem at one of these standoffs, a panicked young soldier opening fire or a protester perhaps getting killed, could touch off a wider war, and everyone knows it.
Well, Terry, give me an idea. If a scenario like that happens, who does that benefit the most in this case?
You'd have to say Vladimir Putin right now. I don't think Putin wants a wider war, but he wants to show Ukraine and he wants to show the West, as he said explicitly today in that remarkable, even astonishing press conference, that sure, people want change. He said, but the West cannot encourage what he called illegal change in the post-Soviet space. In other words, get out of my backyard. And that is what he is trying to demonstrate. So while he doesn't want a war, he's clearly making the biggest and harshest of points here, that he controls these near countries, the near abroad, as they say, to Russia. And so any kind of conflict here, any kind of wider war, A, the Russian military would win, and B, would demonstrate that Vladimir Putin is in charge in this part of the world.
And Terry, with that said, how important is it to see Secretary Kerry visit there today in a diplomatic way, in a way bringing aid, $1 billion in loan guarantees to the new Ukrainian government? What message might that send?
Bringing aid and that message, Michelle, that those ringing Cold War terms that he used about the courage, it almost sounded like solidarity in Poland in the 1980s, of the individual human person and spirit standing up for freedom against tyranny, although it's important to remember that the person they overthrew, Yanukovych, was elected free and fair by a majority of Ukrainians. But it was a revolution, and to hear Secretary of Kerry bring all the weight of the rhetoric of the West and its ideals of democracy and freedom, plus the $1 billion, and pledge, we will stand by you, no question increases the stakes, the United States' commitment to these people, and the legitimacy of their revolution in the eyes of the world. That said, we come back to that question. Now what you're going to do? What kind of cards does Secretary of State Kerry, President Obama, the West, what do they have in the face of Putin's troops and his ruthlessness.
You know, Terry, if you remember with Syria, we've heard a lot about a red line being drawn that the U.S. mentioned. Now the White House talking about Russian troop movement and wanting them to get out, that it would also be a game changer if they stay. So what does that mean? Where do we go from here in this very high-stakes chess match?
Well, it looks, if you listen to Secretary of State Kerry, it looks like there is some wiggle room in there. He said that Russian troops should go back to their barracks. They have a huge base here, so he didn't necessarily say they have to go home. They just have to kind of pull back a little bit. The United States and others have proposed these international monitors who might be able somehow to provide a fig leaf for further negotiations. There is the question of recognizing what Putin says are the concerns that he has for the safety, the political rights of Russian nationals and ethnic Russians in Ukraine. And it's worth noting that that revolution that happened in the West, in Kiev, that Secretary of State Kerry is praising, one of the first things they did was strip the official status of the Russian language in Ukraine. And if you're a Russian speaker, that's a frightening sign. And so maybe there are ways to address legitimate concerns, as Secretary of State Kerry said, to have Russia not necessarily leave, but go back to their base and begin the process of a political solution to get everybody to climb down from the precipice of the abyss here.
You know, we've heard President Obama say that the Cold War is over. Has this all pushed a restart with Russia? You mentioned a lot of Cold War rhetoric.
There's a big difference, though. The Cold War was a clash of systems, communism versus capitalism. This conflict is about the mind and personality and ambitions of one man, Vladimir Putin. It's Putinism versus the West. What is Putinism? It's Russian nationalism, restoring the glory, even the empire of Russia. It's discipline, order, even autocracy in Russia. It's a completely different system than communism, but it is an ideology. You hear it in their media. You hear it in the legislators in elections that are really staged events. They're even teaching it in schools. It's not a Cold War. It's a conflict with what you might call the 21st century czar of Russia, Vladimir Putin.
Very good. ABC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Terry Moran, thank you very much for joining us from Crimea, Ukraine. Stay with abcnews.com for your latest updates on the crisis in Ukraine and all your other headlines. For now, I'm Michelle Franzen in New York with this ABC News Digital Special Report.